In the summer of 2016, the San Juan Mountains of Colorado stood as they always had, majestic, silent, and untamed. Their peaks caught the morning sun like shards of glass, and their valleys swallowed sound, keeping secrets that few ever uncovered. For locals, the mountains were both a playground and a warning. You could hike them, you could climb them, but you could never fully predict them. Storms rolled in without notice. Temperatures dropped in minutes, and trails that looked welcoming could vanish beneath fog or shadow. It was against this backdrop that four teenagers from the small town of Silver Ridge decided to spend a summer weekend together. They were young, restless, and full of the belief that nothing bad could happen to them. They were not strangers to the mountains, nor were they reckless outsiders. They were hometown kids, familiar faces in grocery stores, at the high school gym, on the sidewalks, where everyone knew everyone. And maybe that is what makes their disappearance so chilling. Because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. 7 years later, long after the flyers had yellowed and the news coverage had faded, the soil just miles from their last known location finally gave up part of its secret. And what was found buried there sent a ripple of dread not only through Silver Ridge, but across anyone who remembered the story of those missing teens. Silver Ridge, Colorado, a town of fewer than 2,000 people, tucked away in the folds of the mountains. It wasn't the kind of place where mysteries were supposed to happen. Neighbors waved at each other on porches, the diner on Main Street still used a jukebox, and Friday night football games filled the bleachers. Life moved slowly, predictably. At least, it used to. The four teenagers who would vanish that June had grown up together. They attended the same schools, played in the same parks, and spent countless summers exploring trails, rivers, and abandoned places around town. They weren't outcasts, nor were they the kind of kids who would run away. Their names would soon become etched into the memory of the town. Ethan Hale, Grace Porter, Tyler Kane, and Marissa Young. Ethan was 17, tall, athletic, with the kind of smile that coaches said could rally a whole team. He had dreams of playing soccer at a state university, and scouts had already taken notice of his speed and precision. Grace, 16, was the quiet observer of the group. Her leather-bound journal rarely left her hands, its pages filled with sketches of mountains, song lyrics, and fragments of poetry that hinted at a mind deeper than her shy demeanor suggested. Tyler, also 17, was Ethan's closest friend, and his opposite in temperament, loud, impulsive, always the one to dare others into reckless adventures. He had the kind of energy that drew people in, even when it led to trouble. And then there was Marissa, the youngest at 15. She had been closest to Grace since childhood, following her like a shadow. Reserved and thoughtful, she was known for her long, dark hair and the way she seemed to hover at the edges of every photo, as if she preferred to watch rather than pose. On the morning of June 18, 2016, the four of them gathered at Ethan's driveway. The air was already warming with the promise of a hot summer day, cicadas buzzing in the trees as backpacks and sleeping bags were crammed into the trunk of Ethan's old Honda Civic. Neighbors would later recall seeing them laughing, calling out jokes to one another as they waved goodbye. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing more than a group of teenagers heading out for a routine weekend hike. Their destination was Miller's Peak, a 12-mile loop trail winding up through forest, rock, and exposed ridge. It was not considered the most dangerous trail in Colorado, but it had a reputation for steep climbs and unpredictable weather. The group had explored parts of it before. This time, they intended to complete the loop. Grace had even jotted in her journal the night before. Tomorrow, Miller's Peak with everyone. Last summer, before things change. Her words, later found by her mother, would come to feel like an eerie premonition. The last confirmed sighting of the group came at 3:40 p.m. that same day. A park ranger on patrol spotted them near the base of Miller's Peak. He would later recall how carefree they looked. Tyler joking loudly, Ethan steady as always, Grace trailing with her journal poking from her backpack, Marissa smiling quietly beside her. They seemed prepared, cheerful, and in no danger at all. The ranger waved. They waved back. And then they continued up the trail. That ranger would be the last verified person to ever see them alive. By the following morning, when none of the four had returned home, their parents began to worry. At first, they thought perhaps the hike had simply gone longer than expected. Maybe the kids had camped out overnight, or perhaps their phones had lost service. But as the hours stretched, unease turned into panic. Calls went unanswered, text messages showed only one checkmark, and none of the families had heard a single word. By midnight, the Honda Civic still sat in the gravel parking lot of the trailhead, locked and abandoned. Inside were snack wrappers, a half-empty bottle of water, and Marissa's denim jacket neatly folded on the back seat. The sight chilled her mother when she was told. She never left her jacket behind, she said later, not even in the summer. Somewhere between the base of the mountain and the winding switchbacks above, the four friends had vanished into silence. By the evening of June 18th, when the teenagers had not returned home, the first hints of unease began to ripple through Silver Ridge. At first, parents told themselves there was nothing unusual. The hike might have taken longer. Maybe they had decided to camp out unexpectedly. Service was notoriously poor in the mountains, and missed calls were not uncommon. But as the sky darkened and the sound of crickets replaced the hum of traffic, patience gave way to worry. Ethan's father paced the front porch, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, dialing and redialing his son's number. Each time it went straight to voicemail, the recorded voice of Ethan telling callers to leave a message, echoing like a cruel taunt. Grace's mother sat on her living room couch, staring at the clock, her hands trembling as she left another voicemail that would never be returned. Tyler's older brother drove the winding road toward Miller's Peak twice that night, headlights cutting through the mist, searching for any glimpse of the Honda Civic returning home. And Marissa's parents, quiet and reserved people, whispered to each other in their kitchen, trying not to give voice to the fear already rising in their throats. By midnight, none of the families could pretend any longer. They contacted the sheriff's department. At first, deputies treated it as a welfare check, assuming the group might have camped out overnight. But by the time officers confirmed the Honda Civic still sitting locked at the trailhead, unease turned to urgency. Something was wrong. At dawn, a search was officially launched. The community of Silver Ridge moved as one. Neighbors gathered at the base of Miller's Peak, volunteers forming lines, ready to comb through the forest. The sheriff's department called in search and rescue teams from surrounding counties. Helicopters were deployed to sweep the ridge. Dogs were brought in, trained to pick up human scent along winding trails. Flyers with the teenagers' faces were pinned to gas station windows, grocery store doors, and the notice board outside the diner. Their smiling faces, once familiar and ordinary, now looked hauntingly frozen in time. In the first 48 hours, the search expanded rapidly. Volunteers scoured nearly 20 miles of rugged terrain, calling the teenagers' names into the dense forest. The echoes that returned felt heavier with each unanswered shout. Helicopters circled above, blades thundering, while on the ground, deputies scanned ravines, riverbanks, and cliffsides. They found the car exactly as it had been reported, locked, tidy, undisturbed. Inside were snack wrappers, a folded map, Ethan's phone charger still plugged into the dashboard, and Marissa's jacket draped across the back seat. Nothing suggested a struggle. Nothing pointed to where they had gone. Rain came on the third day. Heavy, relentless rain that poured over the mountains, drenching volunteers and turning soil to mud. Any tracks that might have lingered vanished beneath rushing water. Deputies cursed the weather, aware that whatever clues might have existed were now dissolving into the earth. The days dragged on. By the sixth day, the sheer scale of the search began to take its toll. Volunteers, exhausted and blistered, trickled away, Helicopter hours became limited. Funding and manpower shrank. The once hopeful operation had begun to feel like a battle against an enemy that refused to reveal itself. The families, however, refused to relent. Grace's mother stood before local news cameras, clutching her daughter's photograph. My daughter would never just run away. She was planning next semester. She was writing in her journal the night before. Someone knows something. Someone out there has to know. Tyler's brother grew furious at the lack of progress, lashing out in interviews, accusing the sheriff's office of incompetence. Ethan's father organized volunteers himself, setting up his own search grids when official resources dwindled. Marissa's parents quietly prayed, refusing interviews, but always waiting near the trailhead, as if expecting their daughter to step out of the woods at any moment. But the forest remained silent. Whispers began to circulate in town. Some said the teenagers had gotten lost in a sudden storm and perished in the wilderness, their bodies hidden in places searchers had missed. Others spoke of dangerous drifters who camped in the woods, warning that the group might have crossed paths with the wrong stranger. Online forums speculated wildly, connecting the case to unsolved disappearances across Colorado, suggesting cults or even more sinister possibilities. In a town as small as Silver Ridge, rumor spread faster than fact, and fear grew sharper with every passing day. On the 10th day, the sheriff held a press conference. His words were careful, but heavy. He admitted there was still no physical evidence of what had happened, no signs of a struggle, no discarded belongings beyond the car, no witnesses beyond the ranger who had seen them at the trailhead. He asked the community for patience, but what the community heard was despair. By the end of the second week, the official search was scaled back. Deputies would still respond to tips, but the helicopters were gone, the volunteers dismissed, and the yellow flyers began curling at the corners from summer heat. What remained was a haunting absence. The town of Silver Ridge fell into a kind of suspended grief. People whispered about the case in grocery store aisles, but no one had answers. Teachers kept empty desks on class rosters longer than usual, reluctant to erase names. Parents kept watch over their own children with newfound fear, as if the mountains themselves had turned predatory. The case grew cold. The official search ended in the summer of 2016, but for the families of Ethan, Grace, Tyler, and Marissa, the search never truly stopped. What began as frantic energy slowly hardened into an exhausting cycle of waiting, hoping, and grieving without closure. In the months that followed, each family developed their own rituals of survival. Ethan's father returned to the soccer field every weekend, maintaining the grass where his son once played. He kept Ethan's trophies polished, arranged neatly on a shelf above the fireplace, as though one day his boy might walk through the front door and demand to see them again. His mother refused to wash Ethan's last set of bedsheets, claiming the faint scent of him lingered there. Grace's mother filled notebooks with letters she would never send. "Dear Grace," one began, "I bought new sketch pencils today. You always said you wanted the soft kind for shading. I still can't walk by the art aisle without thinking of you." She kept these letters stacked in a shoebox beside her bed, her way of talking to a daughter who could no longer reply. Tyler's older brother admitted in an interview years later that he used to hear phantom laughter in the house, echoes of his brother's voice bouncing off empty walls. "It was like he was still there," he said, "just out of reach. And then I'd wake up and remember he was gone." Their mother couldn't bear to drive past the trailhead. She took a different route into town for years, avoiding the sight of the sign that pointed toward Miller's Peak. Marissa's parents were quieter, more private. They kept her room exactly as it had been the day she left. Posters on the wall, books on the nightstand, her favorite necklace draped over the lamp. Her mother once confessed to a neighbor that sometimes she set a plate for Marissa at dinner, unable to break the habit of counting her daughter among the living. The town of Silver Ridge itself seemed scarred by the disappearance. For months afterward, flyers remained pinned to bulletin boards, curling under rain and sun. Strangers stopped at gas stations, asking locals about the missing kids. For a while, it felt as though the world had converged on Silver Ridge, cameras and reporters digging for a story. But when no answers came, the world moved on. The families were left behind, alone with their grief. And yet, small flashes of hope surfaced from time to time. In 2018, hikers discovered a lone shoe wedged between rocks north of Miller's Peak. Investigators rushed to the scene, families clinging to the possibility that it might belong to one of the missing teens. For weeks, tension gripped Silver Ridge until forensic tests revealed it was unrelated, a remnant of another hiker lost long before. In 2019, a man came forward, claiming he had given a ride to 4 teenagers near Denver who matched the group's description. He swore he remembered their faces. He swore one girl had a leather journal in her lap. The families clung to the story, but when investigators checked highway cameras and bus station footage, no evidence supported his claims. It was another dead end. In 2020, a local prospector insisted he had uncovered a backpack strap half buried near an abandoned mine. He delivered it to the sheriff's department with trembling hands, convinced it was proof. The strap turned out to belong to an unrelated camper. The case file grew thicker, but the answers never came. Online, the mystery of the 4 missing teens spread across forums and amateur sleuth groups. Some argued they had stumbled into an abandoned mine shaft and were lost forever in the labyrinth below. Others speculated about a passing drifter, a trucker who might have lured them away. More extreme voices spoke of hidden cults in the forest, rituals whispered about, but never proven. Theories grew wild, each stranger than the last, until the truth was buried beneath speculation. But the families never stopped waiting. Every birthday was marked with candles that were never blown out. Every holiday carried the ache of absence, and every phone call from an unknown number sent a shiver of hope down their spines, only to be crushed when it was nothing more than a telemarketer. Years passed. Life in Silver Ridge continued, but under a shadow. Children grew up warned not to wander too far. Parents watched their sons and daughters with sharper eyes. The laughter of teenagers on summer trails now carried a note of unease. And then, in the summer of 2023, 7 long years after the disappearance, everything changed. A group of construction workers had been clearing land just 3 miles from Miller's Peak, preparing ground for a new access road. The area had been untouched for decades, a stretch of overgrown forest few people ever entered. The machinery struck something unusual, something that resisted the metal teeth of the excavator. At first, the crew assumed it was stone, but as they cleared more soil, they realized the ground was giving way to fragments not of rock, but of fabric and bone. Work stopped immediately. The site was shut down. Law enforcement was called in. Yellow tape cordoned off the area. And for the first time in 7 years, the cold silence of the case was broken. Something had been found. Something buried deep in the Colorado soil. The construction site was ordinary until the ground revealed what had been hidden for 7 years. Workers had been tasked with clearing a stretch of land just 3 miles from Miller's Peak, carving space for an access road that would eventually connect to a new development. It was late morning when one of the excavators jolted to a stop, its metal claw grinding against something harder than soil. At first, the crew thought it was stone. Colorado soil often concealed slabs of granite beneath the surface. But when the machine pulled back, what clung to the metal teeth wasn't rock. It was fabric, torn, frayed, and stained dark by years underground. One of the workers jumped down from his machine and began to clear the dirt by hand. He unearthed more fragments, shreds of nylon, a piece of faded denim. Then came something else. A pale shape, fragile, curved. At first he told himself it was animal bone, but the longer he stared, the more certain he became that it wasn't. His stomach dropped. The site fell silent. Someone called the sheriff's department, and within an hour, The quiet clearing was swarmed with law enforcement. Yellow tape stretched between trees. Officers ordered the workers away. What had begun as routine construction was now a crime scene. Word spread through Silver Ridge faster than wildfire. Cars slowed as they passed the site, drivers craning their necks for a glimpse. By evening, news vans lined the narrow road. Satellite dishes pointed skyward. Headlines blared across local television. Possible break in 2016 missing teens case. For the first time in years, the families received a call from investigators not to reassure them, but to prepare them. Something had been found. The excavation continued carefully. Hand tools replacing machines. Each scoop of soil revealed more fragments. Pieces of clothing, partially decomposed. Remnants of shoes, their laces brittle and broken. Then bones delicate, human. A femur, a rib, fragments of a skull. The earth, unwilling to give up its secret for 7 long years, now seemed to spill everything at once. The sheriff gave a brief statement that evening. He did not confirm identities, but admitted the discovery was consistent with human remains. He urged patience, promising forensic teams would begin their work immediately. His words were cautious, professional, but for the families who stood together on the sidelines, tears streaking their faces, the meaning was clear. Their children had been found, or at least some part of them. The following days were a blur of activity. Coroners arrived to carefully transport remains to the state lab. Forensic anthropologists sifted through the soil with brushes and tweezers, recovering even the smallest fragments. Investigators logged every piece of clothing, every thread, every scrap of personal belonging. Among the items cataloged was a leather-bound journal, badly damaged by soil and water. The cover was warped, pages fused together. Still, one name could be faintly read inside: Grace Porter. Her handwriting, barely visible, confirmed the identity. Another item surfaced, a soccer medal, tarnished but intact, engraved with the year 2015 and the name Ethan Hale. There were also 2 backpacks, their fabric torn, their zippers rusted shut. Inside one were pens, a cracked phone case, and a single Polaroid photo of the group, smiling in front of a trailhead sign. Inside the other was nothing but damp soil. The recovery of these items was devastating. For the families, it was proof their children had reached this place. Proof they had not simply run away or vanished into the ether. They had been here. They had lived their last moments here. But the evidence gave no answers, only deeper questions. How had the bodies ended up buried 3 miles from the trailhead, in an area supposedly scoured during the initial search? Why had no one found them before? And perhaps most disturbing, why were the remains not intact? Reports hinted at inconsistencies. Some bones appeared scattered, as if moved. Others showed marks that investigators refused to describe publicly. The sheriff's department stated only that further analysis is required. For the town of Silver Ridge, the discovery reignited every fear and rumor that had once haunted it. Some whispered that the teens had been murdered, their bodies buried to conceal the crime. Others suggested they had stumbled into something dangerous, an accident, a hidden shaft, perhaps even foul play involving people in authority. Theories bloomed overnight, filling news comment sections and online forums. But for the families, all that mattered was this: the soil had finally given something back. After 7 years of silence, they had fragments to bury, fragments to mourn. Yet even as funerals were quietly planned, the sense of closure remained out of reach. Because the discovery, as horrifying as it was, did not explain the one question that had haunted them from the start. What really happened to Ethan, Grace, Tyler, and Marissa on that summer day in 2016? The remains recovered from the soil were transported to the State Forensic Laboratory in Denver, where teams of specialists began the painstaking process of analysis. For the families, The waiting was almost unbearable. 7 years of uncertainty had already stretched them beyond endurance. Now, faced with the possibility of answers, they were torn between desperation and dread. The first confirmations came quickly. DNA testing matched the bones and personal belongings to the missing teenagers. Ethan, Grace, Tyler, and Marissa had indeed been found, but the remains were incomplete. Large portions of each skeleton were missing, fragmented or damaged in ways that could not easily be explained. Grace's journal, though warped and ruined by soil, still contained legible scraps of writing. One page, preserved by some miracle, carried a brief note in her handwriting. "The air feels strange today. Tyler says we should keep moving. Ethan doesn't look worried, but I don't know." The entry was undated, but experts suggested it had been written close to the time of their disappearance. It offered no clarity, only more unease. Autopsy reports painted a disturbing picture. Some bones bore unusual marks. Forensic anthropologists noted striations along the surface of several ribs and femurs lines that might suggest cutting, though weathering could not be ruled out. One investigator described them as marks inconsistent with natural decomposition. Other details deepened the mystery. Ethan's skull showed a fracture on the left temple, sharp-edged, as if caused by blunt force or a fall against rock. Tyler's femur carried an old break that had healed poorly, perhaps unrelated to the incident, but it raised speculation about whether an injury might have slowed him down. Marissa's remains were the least complete, with only partial fragments identified, and Grace's bones showed signs of exposure to heat, though no evidence of fire was found at the burial site. When pressed for explanations, the sheriff's department offered little. "We are continuing to evaluate all possibilities," the official statement read. "At this time, we cannot determine cause of death." Behind closed doors, however, investigators debated fiercely. Some argued the teens had fallen victim to the elements lost, injured, and eventually succumbing to exposure. The scattering of bones, they suggested, could be the work of animals. Others pushed back, pointing to the depth of the burial, the deliberate placement of soil, the unusual marks. Animals don't bury bodies. Even the timeline felt uncertain. Soil analysis suggested the remains had been disturbed at some point after 2016. Layers of sediment indicated that the gravesite might have been reopened, shifted, and reburied. That revelation sent chills through investigators. If true, it meant someone had returned. For the families, the reports were devastating. Instead of closure, they were given fragments, both physical and emotional. Ethan's father clenched the autopsy results in his hands, demanding to know who had fractured his son's skull. Grace's mother, upon hearing about the burned bones, whispered that her daughter must have been terrified in her final moments. Tyler's brother grew angrier, convinced more than ever that foul play was involved, and Marissa's parents, who received so little of their daughter back, felt robbed of even the small comfort of knowing. The town of Silver Ridge reeled once again. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some insisted the teens had stumbled across something they weren't meant to see: drug operations, hidden camps, or even a secret military site. Others whispered of darker explanations, that the marks on the bones were proof of ritualistic killings, the work of a cult long rumored to move through the forests. The sheriff pleaded for patience. He reminded the community that investigations take time, but his reassurances rang hollow. People remembered the failures of the initial search, the way the case had slipped into silence for years. Trust in law enforcement crumbled. For many, it seemed obvious. The truth was being hidden. The media seized on the ambiguity. Headlines screamed of mysterious marks on teen remains and Colorado cold case points to foul play. National news anchors speculated about serial killers, wild animals, and conspiracies. But behind the sensationalism, one fact remained. 7 years after vanishing, 4 teenagers had been found in the soil, and no one could explain why. For investigators, The evidence was like sand slipping through their fingers. The autopsies provided fragments of a story, but the ending was missing. And with every unanswered question, the case grew darker, heavier, and more unbearable for those left behind. What really happened in the summer of 2016? Were the teenagers victims of an accident? Or had someone, perhaps someone close, someone trusted, deliberately ensured they would never return home? The answers, if they existed, remained buried deeper than the soil that had concealed their bodies for 7 long years. The discovery of the remains did not bring peace. If anything, it tore open wounds that had never truly healed, flooding the town of Silver Ridge with fresh grief, anger, and suspicion. For the families, the return of their children, fragmented, incomplete, and shrouded in mystery, felt less like closure and more like a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. Ethan Hale's parents responded in opposite ways. His father grew loud, demanding accountability, pressing the sheriff's department for answers they refused to give. At a community meeting, he slammed his fist on a table, shouting, "Someone buried my son. Someone put him in that ground. Don't you dare tell me it was just nature." His rage was shared by many who believed foul play was the only explanation. Ethan's mother, by contrast, withdrew. Neighbors spoke of seeing her sit for hours on the front porch, staring at the mountains as if waiting for Ethan to come down the trail one last time. When reporters knocked on her door, she simply shook her head and whispered, "Leave us alone." Grace Porter's mother clung to the damaged journal recovered from the site. For her, those pages were not evidence, but a lifeline. She turned each ruined page as though searching for hidden messages, convinced Grace had tried to record something important before the end. "She was writing until the very last moment," she said, her voice trembling. "What did she see? Who was with her?" The community began to whisper that perhaps the journal held secrets that investigators hadn't revealed. Conspiracy theories spread, accusing authorities of withholding pages. Tyler Kane's family struggled with bitterness. His older brother went on record, telling reporters the sheriff's office had failed from the start. "They said they searched those woods. They told us there was nothing out there. And now they find him buried 3 miles from the trailhead? You expect me to believe they just missed that?" His words resonated with townspeople already distrustful of the official narrative. For many, it confirmed suspicions that the original investigation had been botched, or worse, deliberately silenced. Marissa Young's parents remained heartbreakingly quiet. They received fewer remains than any other family. The coroner's report gave them little, only partial fragments of bone, not enough for even a full burial. At her memorial service, her mother held a framed photograph instead of a casket. Friends who attended said the silence in that church was heavier than any words could be. The town of Silver Ridge itself became divided. Some clung to the hope that the discovery might finally lead to truth, urging patience, trusting forensic science. Others demanded immediate answers, convinced the case was being covered up. Old rumors resurfaced about drifters, about strange camps seen in the forest at night, about officials who knew more than they were saying. The sheriff's department tried to calm the storm, but every statement seemed to fuel it further. When asked directly if foul play was suspected, the sheriff responded carefully, "At this time, we cannot rule anything in or out." His words, intended to keep the investigation neutral, were instead seized upon by both sides. For believers in an accident, it was proof nothing sinister had happened. For believers in murder, it was proof of a cover-up. The media poured gasoline on the fire. National outlets ran sensational headlines. Murder in the mountains? The Colorado teen mystery that still haunts families. Buried secrets of Silver Ridge. Reporters descended on the town, shoving microphones in the faces of grieving parents, replaying grainy footage from 2016 of the 4 teenagers loading backpacks into the Civic. Every smile in that footage became tragic. Every glance looked like foreshadowing. The families themselves began to fracture under the pressure. At first, they had stood together, united in grief, holding vigils side by side. But after the discovery, cracks appeared. Ethan's father accused law enforcement of negligence. Tyler's brother demanded a full, independent investigation. Grace's mother fixated on the journal, convinced someone had taken pages. Marissa's parents quietly slipped away from the public eye, avoiding press conferences entirely. Their grief was not the same, and so their paths diverged. For the town, the case became less about answers and more about sides. Some believed the teenagers had fallen victim to a cruel accident exhaustion, exposure, the wildness of the mountains. Others believed darker forces had been at work, pointing to the burial, the marks on the bones, the missing pieces of evidence. At diners, in church pews, and online, the debate raged on. But one thing united everyone: fear. If 4 ordinary teenagers could leave for a hike and never return, what did that mean for the rest of them? Parents forbade their children from wandering too far. Trails once busy with hikers now sat empty, grass growing through the gravel parking lots. The mountains, once a source of pride and beauty, now loomed like a predator on the town's horizon. And beneath all of it was a single, terrible truth. The discovery had not solved the mystery. It had only deepened it. When the autopsy reports were released, and when the sheriff's office failed to give a definitive cause of death, the vacuum of truth was quickly filled by speculation. People needed explanations, and when no single explanation fit, they created their own. The first and most widely accepted theory was that the teenagers had simply fallen victim to nature. The mountains were unpredictable. A sudden storm could sweep across the ridge in minutes, dropping temperatures from warm to freezing. If one of them had been injured, perhaps Ethan with the head fracture, or Tyler with his old leg injury, the group might have slowed, lost their way, and collapsed from exposure. Coyotes or mountain lions could have disturbed the remains. To many, it was tragic but believable. The mountains had taken them, as the mountains had taken others before. But this theory crumbled under scrutiny. If it had been exposure, why were the bodies buried? Why were personal belongings, journals, medals, Polaroids, hidden beneath layers of soil, as though deliberately concealed? Animals do not bury their prey, and no storm digs graves. The second theory focused on foul play. Some pointed to the strange marks on the bones, the incomplete remains, the fractures that did not match accidental falls. They argued that the teenagers had crossed paths with someone dangerous in the forest, perhaps a drifter, a hunter, or a stranger passing through town. They might have been attacked, killed, and buried in haste. Theories multiplied online, with armchair detectives combing through old arrest records, searching for names of predators who might have lived near Silver Ridge in 2016. One name in particular surfaced repeatedly: a man who had lived on the edge of town, known for his violent temper and sudden disappearance just months after the teenagers vanished. He was never officially linked to the case, but forums filled with speculation. Had investigators ignored him? Had he fled before anyone connected him? No evidence ever proved it, but the whispers persisted. A darker theory suggested the teenagers had stumbled onto something they were never meant to see. Silver Ridge had long been surrounded by rumors of hidden drug labs deep in the forest, of old mine shafts used for illegal activity, of secret camps where strangers gathered at night. If Ethan, Grace, Tyler, and Marissa had wandered into such a place, perhaps they were silenced to protect a secret. This theory gained traction when soil analysis suggested the remains might have been disturbed and reburied after 2016. Someone, it seemed, had returned to the site. Why? To hide them better? To move them from one grave to another? The implications were chilling. Then there were the cult rumors. For decades, locals had spoken in hushed voices about strange gatherings in the mountains, circles of candles seen from afar, symbols carved into trees, livestock found mutilated in ways no predator could explain. These stories had always been dismissed as folklore, exaggerated tales passed around campfires. But when the marks on the bones were described as inconsistent with natural decomposition, believers pointed to those old stories. Could the teenagers have fallen victim to something ritualistic? Something meant to remain hidden? And finally, the most unsettling theory of all, that someone in authority had known more than they admitted. Critics argued the burial site was too close to Miller's Peak, an area supposedly scoured during the initial search. How could dozens of volunteers, helicopters, and dogs have missed it? Some suggested incompetence. Others whispered of cover-ups. That someone involved in the original investigation had deliberately steered the search away, perhaps to protect a local suspect, perhaps because they themselves were implicated. These accusations were never proven, but in the absence of answers, suspicion thrives. For the families, each theory was a dagger. If it was nature, they imagined their children freezing in the dark, helpless. If it was murder, they pictured violence, terror, betrayal. If it was conspiracy, they faced the unbearable idea that truth had been buried alongside their children, protected by silence. The town of Silver Ridge split further. In diners and online forums, people argued fiercely. Some clung to the accident theory, unwilling to believe evil could lurk so close. Others insisted foul play was obvious. A smaller group swore the cult stories were real, and a growing number demanded accountability from law enforcement, convinced that the truth was being hidden not in the soil, but in locked filing cabinets at the sheriff's office. But amid all the speculation, one fact remained unshaken. 4 teenagers had gone into the mountains on a summer afternoon, and 7 years later, only fragments of them had come back. What truly happened between those 2 moments was still buried. Beneath lies, beneath fear, beneath secrets, the earth itself seemed reluctant to release. 7 years of silence ended with a shallow grave in the Colorado soil. 4 teenagers, once full of life and promise, reduced to fragments, scattered belongings, and questions that refused to die. The discovery should have closed the book. Instead, it tore the pages wider open. The funerals were quiet, private, and painful. Ethan was buried with his soccer medal, Grace with the remains of her waterlogged journal, Tyler with a photo of him and his brother taped inside the casket, and Marissa with a necklace her mother had kept safe for years. But even as the earth closed over their graves, the mystery refused to rest. Silver Ridge became a town that carried a shadow wherever it went. For every festival, every football game, every quiet evening in the diner, there was the lingering knowledge that 4 of their own had been stolen in broad daylight. Their story left unresolved. Parents held their children closer. Teenagers whispered about the case in hushed voices, daring each other to walk the same trail where Ethan, Grace, Tyler, and Marissa were last seen. Fear turned the mountains into something darker, a place not of adventure, but of warning. Investigators promised the case remained open. But as months passed, no arrests were made, no suspects named, no new evidence announced. The autopsy reports remained vague, the soil samples inconclusive, the journal cryptic. The sheriff's office held one last press conference, saying only, "We continue to follow leads. We urge anyone with information to come forward." His words fell flat. For the families, it sounded like another way of saying we may never know. And so the questions grew louder. Who buried them? Why here, so close to where the search had begun? Why had the graves been disturbed? Why did Grace write about the air feeling strange on that final day? Why did the sheriff hesitate every time he was pressed for answers? Some said the truth would surface one day. That time eventually reveals all secrets. Others believed it had already been buried forever, hidden by those who had reason to keep it silent. And some, perhaps the most haunted of all, whispered that the mountains themselves had claimed the teenagers, and that no human explanation would ever satisfy the emptiness left behind. For the families, life became an endless divide between before and after. Before, when their children laughed, studied, dreamed, and planned. After, when all that remained were theories, fragments, and grief. As for Silver Ridge, the story of the missing teenagers became legend, passed down like a warning. Hikers still walk the trails of Miller's Peak, but they do so carefully, glancing over their shoulders, remembering the faces of Ethan, Grace, Tyler, and Marissa. 4 ordinary kids who left on a hike and never came back. And even now, as you listen to their story, somewhere in those mountains, the wind still howls through the trees, carrying with it the silence of that day in 2016. A silence broken only by the question that refuses to die. What really happened to them,